Now this has had a mixed reaction amongst the community. Some people have said this is great. Sydney's nightlife has declined quite significantly. Some of our favorite bars and clubs have closed down. We can't stay out late and have a drink. Sydney used to be a bit like Amsterdam in some ways, but now things are very different. Melbourne has beaten us in many ways. Other people have argued, quite reasonably, that maybe things aren't so bad. Maybe it isn't a good idea to have drunk people yelling out in the streets at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning when they're trying to sleep. And maybe it's a good idea to have less violence. And maybe we don't want to see a return back to Sydney that used to be when I was in my first year of uni. And if you probably don't even remember what that city looked like, so what are we really missing out on? Well, I'm not here to make up your mind for you. You can probably tell where I lie on this topic. I quite frankly think that those laws have no place in civilized society, but that's just my opinion. Here to tell us about this topic and to convince you one way or the other are two people who are a lot more knowledgeable than I am. And we're going to hear from each of them for about 15 minutes and then throw it to the audience. So first I'd like to welcome up on stage to tell us why, to make the case against the lockout laws, former Australian Senator David Lionel.
I suppose, on a university, a bit of a risky thing coming to a Liberal club event. I'm disappointed actually that there's nobody outside the door protesting. I thought at least we'd attract a bit of attention of that nature.
We're very calm here at Macquarie.
Yes,
like super calm.
very nice.
Anything goes.
We told them it was downstairs.
You can tell I'm no longer a senator because I'm the one not wearing a tie anymore. But what I'm going to talk to you about is, in the context of the lockouts, the subject of moral panics. A moral panic is what happens when the media, the chattering classes, and various commentators create a perception that action is urgently required on a matter of great importance. Now, once it begins, it's relatively self-reinforcing. The media interviews commentators who agree with the media, which agrees with the commentators. And day after day, they interview politicians and ask them why they aren't doing something. We've seen many moral panics: interest rates, pedophile priests, cyberbullying, the road toll, vicious dogs, foreign ownership of farms, the ice epidemic, guns, outlaw motorcycle gangs, and there's plenty more. Terminology is important. For example, there's currently a moral panic over so-called wage theft. Now that sounds bad, but all it means is being paid less than what the Fair Work Commission says somebody should be paid. It wouldn't sound at all serious if it was simply called being paid less than what the government dictates. In each moral panic, there's a smattering of facts, plenty of bullshit, plus an absolute surplus of opinion. To paraphrase Paul Keating, every pet shop galah joins the fray. So it was with the lockout laws. King's Cross had always been a place where drunks got drunk, strippers stripped, sex workers made money, and you could party all night. Where you could listen to live music, fall in love, buy drugs, buy sex, get drunk and have a good time. King's Cross was Sydney's red light district, its naughty suburb. I'm old enough to remember the Americans coming to King's Cross on R&R, that's rest and recreation, in the 1960s during the Vietnam War. Many Australian girls did pretty well out of that. But in January 2014, Daniel Christie died from hitting his head on the footpath after being punched just once. It was a random attack and it occurred at 9 p.m. It happened just metres from where another teenager, Thomas Kelly, suffered the same fate in July 2012. He was punched once and also hit his head on the footpath. It was 10 p.m. The person responsible for Kelly's attack was on bail for violence. He had a significant criminal record and assaulted several other people on the same night. He had been drinking heavily. The person responsible for the attack on Christie was an MMA fighter who assaulted several other people at the same time. I understand he was also drunk, and I understand also that drugs were involved. Now, a day or so after the Christie assault, the Sydney Morning Herald wrote the following. The Christie family has described the assault that killed their rugby keen son as the coward's punch, and his death will add to the pressure on the O'Farrell government to take action to stem the violence on Sydney streets. King Hits have claimed 91 lives in Australia since 2000, according to Monash University's Forensic Medicine Department. Its study found New South Wales had the highest toll with 28 victims. Now this is the Herald creating its own story, building pressure on the government to take action, to stem the violence on the streets. You don't question whether there is violence on the street. One incident or two incidents are enough. The coward punch term, the media picked up on that, and politicians subsequently picked up on it. Plus, there are endless opportunities in a story like that to do follow-ups, quoting people who reinforce the negative narrative, and of course, demanding why haven't politicians done something. The reference to Monash University data is almost certainly complete crap. King hits are not recorded, and even if such violence or such report exists, it would inevitably involve all sorts of qualifications and assumptions. It's never been quoted in any of the reviews or inquiries that I'm aware of, and I am aware of most of what's gone on. Yet, for all that, it did the trick. That report, plus others like it, did the trick. Politicians acted, the moral panic kicked in. So in February 2014, just the following month, the government passed legislation to impose a minimum 8-year sentence for alcohol-related assaults causing death, 10 p.m. closing time for bottle shops, 1:30 a.m. lockouts, and 3 a.m. closing times for all licensed venues within the CBD and King's Cross. The Star Casino was exempted, despite having quite a high rate of violence itself, and police were given the power to search anyone suspected of committing a drug or alcohol-fuelled offence. Now, I chaired the Senate Nanny State Inquiry, which conducted a hearing into the lockouts. We were told the lockout policy had led to a big reduction in alcohol-fuelled violence in lockout zones, 26% by some accounts. However, we were also told there had been an increase in assaults outside these areas, Star City and Newtown especially. But we were told there was a net reduction overall, and I think that's most likely true, although it's unlikely to have reached double figures. Among those who gave evidence in support of the lockouts was St Vincent's Hospital. Now, I haven't met Dr. Crozer before today, so I don't want anyone to think I'm being personal here. But I have met people from St Vincent's quite a number of occasions, and in relation to this lockout issue, amongst others. The St Vincent's Hospital people were obviously seeing fewer trauma cases. They supported the lockout policy. In retrospect, I suppose we should have invited doctors from other hospitals, particularly perhaps RPA, because I think they would have seen an increase in cases. St Vincent's reminds me of the South Park episodes in which one of the parents screeches, "Won't someone think of the children?" And of course, it saves just one life. If saving lives was the only concern, we would impose lockouts nationwide. Even better, a complete ban on alcohol and a nationwide bedtime. We'd all smoke cannabis, which doesn't lead to violence. But saving lives is not the only concern. Life is not just a matter of existing. Quality also matters. Personal freedom, responsibility, plus of course, opportunities to live a fulfilling life. They also matter a lot. So now King's Cross is a middle-class dormitory suburb. Thousands of hospitality workers have lost their jobs. The live music industry was devastated. Sydney's sinning is now spread out over a much wider area, and the police have more trouble keeping an eye on the real crims. In 2016, the government adjusted the lockout laws for live music venues by a whole half an hour. Then last month, finally, a parliamentary committee recommended abandoning the lockouts, plus some of the more silly restrictions on service of alcohol. The Premier says she agrees, and there is a lot of general nodding. I think we can at least say the moral panic is over. Of course, it is too late to restore King's Cross to where it was. Most of it is irretrievably lost to selfish NIMBYism. But it need not be completely lost. Sydney could once again have its fun suburb. How that might occur is a matter for another time perhaps. What I want to discuss for the next few minutes is the broader implications raised by the lockouts and associated measures, and in particular, what they say about the kind of society that we are, or do we want to become. Do we want a society in which the government can tell us what time we have to go home? And if we don't like that, the only option is move to Melbourne, where we can't have a straight whiskey, even 100%, or even 100-year-old Scotch whiskey for $100 a shot, unless it's before midnight. That's the current rule. Do we care that Sydney is fast losing its claim to be Australia's major city? A city that compares unfavourably to major cities around the world, where alcohol and late nights seem to get on okay, like Paris, Rome, London, Berlin, Vienna, and many more, where nobody is treated like naughty children and sent home to bed. But most importantly, from my perspective, do we want a society that punishes its citizens collectively? Despite the fact that it is individuals, a small number at that, who engage in alcohol-fueled violence, Australian authorities have a bit of a fixation about collective punishment. It starts in school. 1 or 2 kids misbehave, so the entire class is punished. It continues throughout life. Someone leaves some empty beer bottles on the beach, and the next thing is you can't take beer to the beach. In almost every aspect of life, there are restrictions arising from a small number of individuals having done something inconsiderate, stupid, criminal, or dangerous. In the Senate, this became a very big concern of mine because of the anti-terrorism laws. Everyone has had their freedom restricted because of a very small number of people posing a threat. I'm sure you will have heard the saying, spoiling it for the rest of us. Now, that's collectivism, spoiling it for the rest of us. The rest of us shouldn't have it spoiled. I'm a libertarian, a classical liberal. I hate collectivism. I'm an individual, and I accept responsibility for what I do. But I don't want to be held responsible and punished for what others do. The lockout laws are yet another example of collective punishment. Everyone gets punished for the sins of a few. I believe the challenge is to get governments to worry about the few. Arrest and punish those who do the spoiling. Oblige the police to do their job properly. Ban the troublemakers. And leave everyone else alone. I don't think ending the lockouts is anything like what I would advocate in the way of our society, but it is a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thanks for that, David. All right, our next speaker is Dr. John Crozier from St. Mary's Hospital, right in the forefront of the violence issue in King's Cross. So, welcome up.
Thank you very much. From the outset, I'll acknowledge that we're standing on the land of the traditional owners, the Wallam Mothergal, and they've held this land in sacred trust for at least 40,000 and arguably 60,000 years. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I acknowledge that we as Anglo-Celts have brought with us ethanol as a problem that disproportionately harms that Indigenous group. And I express my sorrow. Now, I'm honoured and privileged to be able to address young minds. It's a gift in the walls of the hospital we don't often get across the breadth of faculties represented here. We are privileged to see the top 2 intellects, or 2% of the intelligentsia, if you like, as medical students, but it's a very cloistered environment within the walls of the hospital. So it's a rare privilege to stand in front of the minds, the young minds, here today. It's an honour to have been asked to represent a prose side, if you like, in a debate. I'm like David, country born. David comes from Neil in Victoria, the Wimmera. I come from Clare. Now, when I grew up in Clare, there was only one winery, and that was the Jesuit vineyard at Seven Hills. I come from a family of 6. There are a number of alcoholics in the family, a number of hotel owners. I acknowledge that 1 in 8 of us gets an addiction to ethanol, which they cannot control. I'm privileged also, like David, to have had a tertiary education. I came by choice to New South Wales. I worked for 4 years in St Vincent Hospital. The area of greatest need for the sort of surgery that I have a passion for, and that's trauma, is in southwest Sydney. Now, that demographic is fundamentally very different to that of St Vincent's. It's an exciting demographic. There are almost 50% of people that come from other parts of the world, newly arrived. Pretty much every language on the face of the earth represented, every culture. Within the walls of the hospital, the spectrum is from the young all the way to the old. Every uniform, every outfit that you could imagine. I'm actually a minority group. I'm 5th generation Australian born, from free settlers, and I'm monolingual. I speak Australian. So I rely heavily often for others to translate for me. Now, in the journey through medical school, I have seen the disproportionate ravages that ethanol wreaks in community. And it's a ubiquitous smell in the emergency department. Something you get inured to pretty early. You don't ask, you frequently don't bother to ask, have you been consuming alcohol before? And you don't document it. So the scale of that problem actually goes very significantly underrepresented. What I'm going to do now is just phrase this further 7 minutes in terms of children, women, and petrol. And this is really a tale of 2 cities. So earlier this year, there was actually a survey of 34,000 around the globe invited to state what the best international city globally was. Number 1 was New York. Number 2 in this survey of 34,000 people all the way around the world was Melbourne. Sydney was 36. Now, New York, you can't legally consume ethanol until you're 21. You go on to the alcohol laws for New South Wales, New York. When does cessation, last drinks of ethanol, alcohol, occur? 4 a.m. That's an international city. You can't drink in a public place in New York. That's an offence. Number 1 international city. It doesn't define itself by ethanol. Children, women, petrol. How many of you have got young kids? I don't see many women here. I see disproportionately more males. And the ethnicity is not that represents what contemporary Australia is or what Australia is going to look like. I was talking to a paediatrician, a friend of mine, who looks after kids, 6 weeks ago. Andrew was telling me about this 11-year-old boy he was seeing for the first time with bedwetting. Now, as he took the history, the trigger for that bedwetting was the sound of his mother's head being thumped against the wall or the floor, or the sound of the screams as she was smashed repeatedly by her partner, intoxicated, and frequently bringing home the slab of takeaway sold beer to continue to consume in the domestic environment. Anxious young people frequently are victims of domestic violence, and unless you lift that lid, it doesn't scuttle out. But the scale of the domestic violence issue in this state is huge. And in 2010, a report by the then Auditor General acknowledged that there have been 91,000 presentations of domestic violence, mainly women, to the police. 81,000 perpetrators in 2010. There was an acknowledgement that the recidivism rate, half of those perpetrators in the 5 years prior had had a police call-out. Now, for every one of those incidents of domestic violence, there are at least 7 that go unreported. Frequently when the police turn up, the partner who's been smashed says, no, I don't want to make this a police report. The hard, objective evidence back in 2010 in this state, 91,000 victims of domestic violence requiring a police call-out, and 81,000 perpetrators. In 2018, as Gladys Berejiklian came into her premiership, she put up 12 priority projects. The economy was number 1. Down at number 7 was the reduction by 25% of domestic violence by 2021. Now, why am I talking about domestic violence? Well, we need to be fairly precise, looking at the amendments that were made to the Liquor Act of New South Wales 2007, the 3rd Amendment in February of 2014. There was only one whole of state measure. What was that? It was the restriction on takeaway sales to 10 p.m. Now that slipped under the radar. That wasn't a lightly embedded, carefully thought through requirement of meaningful material change to reduce domestic violence. That had been a carefully considered policy consideration by a not-for-profit, completely non-vested entity called the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education. No axe to grind, but a strong desire to reduce alcohol-related harm in the community. That was the only whole-of-state measure, 10 p.m. restriction on takeaway sales. The sort of sales that the intoxicated patrons of pubs pick up as they go home to continue an ethanol-fueled journey in their places of domicile. A material contributor to the 91,000 cases that have a policeman come, and the police would document about 70% of those cases to which they are called alcohol consumption. Ethanol consumption has been part of the problem, either by the perpetrator or by the punished. It is a huge problem. Now, I just made some comments outside in relation to cannabis. It is the case that the revenue raised on the beer, wine and spirits go to as tax the Commonwealth Government. The state picks up the pieces. And at the scale of the drinker, it's a $21 billion spend for the harm to the individual drinker per annum. That's back in 2008. We were the first country to look at the scale of the harm to those around the drinker. In 2010, that was reported. The methodology has been taken up by the WHO and replicated around the world. But this is not a good look. We were the first nation to actually quantitate. And I acknowledge there are some here who have an accountancy and an economic background, and you guys are the key players in this space. So on the harm side, those around the drinker, caught up by injuries, caught up by the fact there's been a loss of income, caught up by the fact they're in a judicial system, that cost is 21,000 million per annum. Put them together, 15 and 21, what do you get? $36 billion per annum is what we pay picking up pieces. Now let's come back. We've talked about the kid, we've talked about the women. Petrol. Who drives a car? What do you put in it to fuel it?
Ethanol. Petrol.
Use E10?
Yeah.
So what's the E?
Ethanol.
Excellent, 10? 10%, excellent. So 1/10 of that petrochemical is ethanol. C2 fragment, unlike the C1 fragment, methanol, you put that into the system, what does that do? You initially go a bit blind, drink a bit more, and you die. And it doesn't take long to die, it's a pretty horrible death. C2 fragment with a bit of OH on it. Ethanol is what we put in our cars because it's a very energy dependent molecule. It combusts, it detonates, so it's good to power cars. Beer, wine, spirits. E5, E12 and E40. So your beer is 5% ethanol, your wine is 12% ethanol, and your Scotch nip is 40% ethanol. Now ethanol just happens to be a class 1 cancer-causing molecule. It does not get any more cancer-causing than a class 1 molecule. So 16% of the ethanol consumed in our women in Australia is the material direct contributor to their breast cancer. It's a significant contributor to colon cancer, to oropharyngeal cancer. It pushes blood pressure up, it screws around with cholesterol, it fricks with your liver, it knocks your heart around, it buggers the rhythms of your heart, it fucks the bone marrow and cell production. There are 200 health conditions exactly sheeted home to the consumption of ethanol. Now, there is no safe level of ethanol consumption. We're pretty fragile animals. We are fragile animals. We have an organic chemistry that is constant through the whole universe. We're the product of a whole range of stars that have detonated, and it's taken a while in the journey of evolution to get to this point. We're doing a pretty good job in a very short space of time to knock the hell out of an evolved, higher being. And ethanol is a common part of that harm. Now getting back to that whole estate measure, 10 p.m. restriction on takeaway sales, implemented as part of the amendments in February of 2014. Now David skated across a few things. Saatchi skated across a few things. A couple of assertions were put in front of you. Saatchi began by referring generically to a couple of deaths in about 2011. Now David was more dignified, and he honoured by name, and he cited accurately the years on which Thomas Kelly and Daniel Christie had been killed by somebody with ethanol on board. Every week there's one partner of somebody ethanol fueled who is killed. Every week. So the 365 Australians killed by being around the drink. Within the health system in this state, the objective evidence is there is an escalation in the numbers presenting with ethanol or alcohol injury. I'll show you the graphs in the next, if I'm allowed an opportunity to rebut. And how many minutes have we been going? 13, okay, that's
14 actually.
That's 4 too long. Okay, so I'm going to close. We've seen the Callanan review in 2016 acknowledged that the measures seem to be working really well. He broad-based submissions. He acknowledged an 8.4% reduction in non-domestic violent assault through the whole of New South Wales, in time temporarily related to that introduction of a takeaway on a restriction on takeaway sales. Shortly after the Callanan review, we've pushed that to 11. Now, slipping under the rug, as we look at the reversion to pre-existing, is the take to midnight takeaway sales. That will materially contribute to an escalation in domestic violence. It will mean Premier Berejiklian has to further push to the right, kick the tin down the road in relation to reducing by 25% recidivist domestic violence. Now, the Attorney General said that's a bit ambiguous, that definition. It's a bit imprecise. Let me take you through that again. Berejiklian had committed to reducing by 1/4 the 81,000 mainly males who come to police attention due to domestic violence each year. And she realised the calibration was poor, the screening tool was poor, so she's kicked that target down the road. So we're accepting, as we wind back the last sale in places of takeaway liquor sale, not a reduction. We can predictably anticipate an escalation in the domestic violence. And that's not a good look from a woman Premier. It's not a good look from anyone. And it's not a good look in our commitment to kids and particularly to women. Thank you.
All right. Before I throw it to the floor for questions, I'm going to give each speaker 6 minutes to rebut the other speakers' points. David?
6. I don't need 6. The proposition that John offered to you is that alcohol is bad, and that therefore any kind of restriction on alcohol and its availability is a good thing. This is essentially the position of FAIR, the Foundation of Alcohol, what do they call it? Research, something like that, yeah. They used to lobby the hell out of me on anti-alcohol positions when I was in the Senate. They just don't like alcohol, full stop. Now, I don't mind if people don't like alcohol. It's decades since I drank too much alcohol, and that's my choice. And that's the issue, I guess, is that no one forces us to drink alcohol, and no one forces us to drink a lot or a little bit. That's the position that I think is more tenable, is more honourable. You say, okay, well, yes, alcohol can be bad, so can lots of things be bad. Is it an appropriate response by the government to treat everybody as if we are latent alcoholics, that any restrictions on the availability of alcohol to people like me, who doesn't drink very much, you, I presume most of you don't drink very much, there might be one or two who get stuck into it too hard, but I presume most of you don't. Is it okay for the government to make life difficult for you so that you can't enjoy yourselves, despite the fact that when you do enjoy yourself it's perfectly harmless? And plus all the other Australians out there who don't abuse alcohol, who don't abuse their partners, who don't engage in domestic violence, who aren't violent folks when they have too much to drink. It is not an appropriate response by the government to treat everybody as if they are a criminal in waiting. We are not criminals in waiting. And the appropriate response by the government, if they weren't lazy and just trying to appear as if they're doing something, is to go after the small number of individuals who harm others from their behaviour. Frankly, I don't think it's any business of the government if you harm yourself. It's the same as taking cannabis. That might not be good for you. Some people it's definitely not good for them. But that's not the government's business. It's only the government's business if you're harming somebody else. That's the liberal principle. They're gone off.
Swap mics. Swap mics, perhaps.
It's only the government's business when somebody else is being harmed. And the same with alcohol. Yes, domestic violence is a crime. Yes, it should be dealt with quite severely. I'm very much in favour of dealing with it very firmly. But we don't all beat our wives or our husbands. In fact, most of us don't. And to say, well, you can't have alcohol beat up your wives or your husbands is authoritarian. It's a ridiculous way to approach a free society. I don't think it's acceptable. The lookout laws are like that. Some people can't handle alcohol, some people came to King's Cross and caused trouble. As a consequence, nobody can go to King's Cross and stay out late and drink late. You've all got to go home to bed. This collective treatment, lowest common denominator nonsense. Free society should not do that.
Thanks. Dr. John?
No, I haven't just put a few slides in. I was trying to avoid.
I'm sorry, I want to use your computer.
That'll work. How do we go wide? Can we?
I don't think that's going to set up.
It was before.
Oh, 1 second.
That's all right.
You've got to bring the screen down, haven't you?
That's all right. I was just going to show you what facial maxillary injuries look like. Because David's made some assertions about potential displacement to Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, which are not factual. In fact, there's several assertions too, that at 3 a.m, that is the last point of sale under the amendment in February 2014. So a one-way door was introduced at 1:30. That's factually correct, not the last sale. The last sale was at 3 a.m. Hotels could choose to stay open as long as they pretty much wanted, but they realised that they couldn't make profit if they shut at 3 a.m. Now, of the 12 priorities, Gladys had the economy as one of her priorities. I wasn't going to buy that book. Do you know who John Ibrahim is?
Yeah.
But my wife was having her hair done and I picked up the preface. Paragraph 2. I've got a historical, emotional, and not to mention financial connection with the cross. I always will. The lockout laws were a blessing in disguise, even though they didn't seem like that to me at the time. They were assigned to let it go. A tap on the shoulder telling me there's nothing to fight for anymore. If this screws a business model and gets somebody like this the hell out of town, why change the laws? Now that's what I want you to remember. Okay? E10 is what you put in your card. When you see a BWS sign, E5, E12, E40. So when you take your nip of scotch just after midnight in your nice tumbler, that's 40% ethanol you're sculling, okay? And you can do that 2 times and you've had, at this stage, a safe consumption. There is no safe consumption of ethanol. There's low risk, there's high risk. Oh, by the way, if you're considering pregnancy, then in that first few weeks, when you don't even know you're pregnant, the ethanol that you consume, small in quantity, may result in FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And we don't know the scale of that in our country. We haven't calibrated. We don't know. By the way, we've been coasting without a national alcohol strategy for the last 7 years. That's what the Liberal government at a federal level sees in its respect in regard to harm reduction by alcohol. There is what's called regulatory capture, and that's particularly what I want to impress on you. So we are in an environment of regulatory capture. The multinationals that purvey the beer, wine and spirits control government. We've just had a brown paper bag or a plastic bag from Aldi, bit of cash. I can tell you the scale of what softens every side of government, from the multinationals that purvey the alcohol beverages, sees regulatory capture. Now this is factual, okay? This is what's going on in New South Wales. Alcohol admitted injuries going up. These were the facts. So at 3 a.m, alcohol service was ceased. That wasn't the time people were moved out under that February 2014 amendment. But it was difficult to keep a business viable. Now let me tell you, there are many more licences, liquor licences, since February of 2014. There are many small bars. There's actually been an increase in the number of licensed premises in the Sydney Entertainment Precinct since February of 2014. So we're being spun a lot of false news, fake news. These are facts from the Bureau of Crime Statistics. This is what happened in the Entertainment Precinct. This is what happened in the King's Cross Precinct straight after. You can see a downward trend. There are annual variations. Summer, peak, the warmer weather season, and it's particularly males. Pissed, punching, drops off a bit in winter, a bit cold to be doing that. Peaks again, downward trend, but really dramatic reductions after that February 2014. Now there was no accident about those measures. They were introduced in 2008 in Newcastle. They'd been seen to work very dramatically, and it was the police who initiated those laws, a suite of measures. We call them a lockout because it's pejorative. It's what the industry want us to see. Oh, and if you don't believe that you've got regulatory capture, look at what the report 2 weeks ago was. Word for word, it's the same as the submission from DRGO. Now, who's heard of DRGO? A lot of quizzical heads. Okay, so Bacardi, hymns, a lot of your spirits. These guys are telling government the words they want in the next version of what drops out. That is what regulatory capture is. This is what a facial maxillary injury looks like. It's a disfiguring, often whole-of-life consequence. It's a good surrogate marker for ethanol in either the perpetrator or the patient. This is evidence that doesn't go away. For 10 years before, the Vinnie's guys had been tracking facial maxillary data. They had no idea the amendments were going to come in 14. But they tracked, in the 2 years before that amendment, there were 145 of those injuries managed. Really bad, ties up operating theatre for several hours, often multiple take-backs, faces often fairly disfigured for years after. That's the 2 years after. A 60% reduction in that pattern of injury. There has been no intensive care requirement for any head-injured patients since the laws were brought in Vinnie's. It's a direct downstream main trauma centre from the Cross. Now, that pattern of injury, it's easy. You can check whether it's gone elsewhere. It hasn't. So there is no evidence of displacement when you look at that pattern of injury. So on that note, I'm going to step on my high horse. These laws are worth preserving, okay? They increase the amenity. They are easily replicable across the state and will bring great benefit. And we know that. We need to be evidence persuaded. I do thank you for the privilege of speaking.
All right, to might kick things off, I might ask the first question. So, we heard a lot about how the evils and the harms of alcohol, how it's a co-founding factor in domestic violence and so on. I'm not 100% sure how that links up with the lockout laws itself, which pertain to drinking in a licensed establishment. So that's one point. The second point is, you mentioned it's a good thing that we have people like John Abraham who are out of business and are out of the Cross. Well, maybe that is a good thing. But I've personally spoken to plenty of business owners and people who lost their jobs, lost their livelihoods, people whose venues were not even violent, people who always took the right precautions, made sure that people weren't getting too intoxicated, kicked them out of it when they would be in danger themselves or others, who were badly, terribly affected by this, who lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. You mentioned there have been more licenses issued since 2014. That doesn't tell the full picture. This has severely damaged a lot of honest, hardworking business people who just wanted to give people a good, responsible time. Third point is, I don't think there's any dispute that violence dropped on the Cross massively. Absolutely. A lot of these figures, though, are not adjusted for actual foot traffic. I work in the Cross, and to be completely honest, this is anecdote, of course, but I actually feel less safer now because the streets are deserted. If it seems to me then that the reduction in violence has to do primarily with people not coming to the area anymore. So I'd just like to, I guess, hear your response to these points.
I thought I was only debating with David.
I'm sorry, can you just press the mic?
I think the batteries might be dying.
Both.
Oh, that mic still works.
Yeah, we could do that like yeah, that stuff.
Batteries are dying on both of them.
Saatchi, thank you. I thought I was only playing David. Saatchi began with the premise, and he used the word evil. Now, evil is on a moral plane, okay? This is not a moral that I've been talking about. I've been talking about organic chemistry. I've been talking about objective facts. I've been showing you what it's like in my office. And I've got a range of evidence of measures that have been proven to work in Newcastle. They weren't lightly flipped out in 2014. Now, we should remember the lead up in 2014. It wasn't those two deaths. They were high profile. There was a succession of ethanol-fuelled violence and craziness. And I've shown you those diurnal peaks, the peaks in summer. It's an entirely predictable thing. So we have seen material and significant reductions in alcohol-related issues. We have seen an increase in amenity, and this is a consistent statement from those that reside at the Cross. And by the way, Saatchi, as you walk through George Street in the last 4 years, have you noticed how many businesses have closed? Because there's a body of work that's been ongoing for the last 4 years.
Oh, sure.
And how much do we see of business reduction, bankruptcies, because we've got a delayed work in progress through George Street? We don't see a skirrick of that evidence out there in the public domain. It's convenient for this government to have the narrative. And what I want you to do is read the report released 2 weeks ago. Might I say there's a Deloitte financial review which the committee had access to. That's not in the public domain. This is an opaque process. The police violence data, which should be in the public domain, is not there. And the words in that report are exact cuts and pastes from industry submissions. And I'll close with the hubris of the assertion by the chair that Sydney is Australia's only global city, and emphasise that is quintessential hubris, and what follows through the rest of the 167 pages is regulatory capture in spades. Thank you.
If you haven't already worked out, I'm a South Park fan, and I love it when Mr. Mackey says drugs are bad. Just love it. So what we have with Dr. Crozier here is alcohol is bad. Okay. Now, I'm probably not disagreeing with that. We can accept that alcohol is not all good, at least, and quite possibly more bad than good. But let's be realistic here. The Romans like to drink. There's really not much point in saying, oh, let's get rid of alcohol. Let's partly get rid of alcohol. What we're seeing now with the taxes on alcohol is a lot of people giving up on drinking alcohol, or they're drinking at home, getting totally pissed at home before they go out because it's much cheaper to do that. And why is there such a controversy about pill testing? Because when they go to music festivals, they ban alcohol. So what do they do instead? Take pills. People are going to get out of their reality one way or another. There is no point pretending that these things are just going to go away. And it is an absolute consistent flaw of governments in Australia to think that a problem can be regulated away. Alcohol consumption can't be regulated away, drug consumption can't be regulated away. What we can do, though, is regulate and enforce laws against bad behaviour that harms others. You can't regulate for stupidity, but you can regulate for hitting other people, harming other people, causing misery to other people who've done no wrong. That's what our governments ought to be focusing on. They shouldn't be trying to tell us to live an alcohol-free life or a less alcohol-consumptive life. a less drug consumptive life. It shouldn't be telling us we have to go home to bed. The government should not be regulating our lives. The only thing the government's got a legitimate interest in is stopping us from hurting other people. That's all. Now, if alcohol's been around since the Romans, we are talking nonsense here if we are trying to pretend that somehow or other laws imposing when we can buy alcohol from bottle shops, when we can go to the pub, and how late we can stay out in King's Cross and drink alcohol is going to make a scrap of difference in the long run. It won't. It doesn't make a scrap of difference. And of course, alcohol is not an Australian issue. The French drink it, the Germans drink it, the Belgians drink it. The Belgians drink more beer than we do. The Americans drink it, they get a bit anal about it. They won't let you drink it in most states until 21. I don't think that's across the whole country, but certainly it's quite common over there. But and every country has its drunks, but they're adult about it in most places. We can be adults too.
All right, first question, Damien.
Microphone?
Yes, sir.
I remember when I went out to the city in the Cross before lockout was, and I was actually surprised to see quite a lot of violence on the streets. It wasn't one or two sort of occasional fights, but I saw sort of almost gang brawls on a couple of occasions. And I was just wondering, is our society becoming more violent of late? Is it becoming less violent? Are we just more sensitive to it? Is there anything that we can do on the cultural level to ensure responsible behaviour with recreation and alcohol?
Dr. John.
I won't be evasive in the sense that it's not a body of knowledge that I have evidence for. But what I will say is the objective evidence is that if you put 10,000 litres of ethanol into an Australian community, you'll get a 26% increase in domestic violence. Now that statistic is replicated again and again and again in postcodes in Melbourne. What I can also say is that if you consume ethanol after midnight in the Cross or other environments where there are a lot of liquor licences, you get a 20% increase in non-domestic violent assaults for every hour of trade after midnight. And that's replicated again and again and again. And it's at least that scale of violent assault requiring police call out on the domestic violence side also. So those are facts. They're referable. They are from independent entities like the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. And I commend this jurisdiction. Known as the Rum Court in the early days of government, we've moved a little bit away from that. We're still, our gross domestic product is 15% dependent on our gaming, our lotteries. A significant percentage is due to the alcohol industry funds. And we are, as I said, regulatory captured in a way that no other jurisdiction is in Australia from the alcohol industry. And you need to be aware of that. There are some subliminal messages that we've got a bad culture. That's what the industry want us to say every time we get up. And they want a doctor, every time the doctor gets up to say something, to say, oh, we've got a bad culture and I do drink, but that is what the industry want, particularly people like me as a doctor to say. In 1945, after World War II, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, you could see full-page advertisements of white-coated doctors with cigarettes in their mouth, advocating the benefit to their asthmatic patients because it makes them cough. Doctors are not reliable sources of evidence, and too many of us own vineyards. Much of the industry evidence for the benefit of red wine consumption is funded by industry, and as I say, too many medicos are in the industry too deep. So be careful. There is no risk drinking. There is low risk and there is high risk consumption. And that's the objective scientific reality.
So your question was there a violence culture, based on your observations visiting the Cross? There was for a time. I mean, the Cross has been the Cross for over 50 years. And that level of violence that you observed was a relatively recent phenomenon. And it was an issue. There was no question, and nobody denied that. The pubs and clubs and restaurants and so forth acknowledged that there was an issue. The pubs and clubs and restaurants and so forth acknowledged there was an issue with the current level of violence in the Cross at the time. What had been occurring up until the time of the lockouts was an ID system in which people who had been involved in violent altercations, either in the Cross or who the police knew about from elsewhere, were prohibited from entering venues in the Cross. That system was being rolled out and was only just starting to be used on it wasn't even fully rolled out around the Cross when the lockouts were brought in. That's the appropriate response to that. In other words, there are some individuals who are responsible for the bulk of the violence, a small number. They weren't being dealt with. The police weren't dealing with them. That's a failure. The police, the King's Cross police station is notorious for being lazy and corrupt. Absolutely notorious. They were right up to form over that period. I'm not sure they've improved a lot since then either, to be frank. And so individuals responsible for a lot of the violence were still causing a lot of the violence. However, there was, in my opinion, an appropriate measure in place to deal with those people, which was to lock them out, keep those ones out and let everybody else in. So the only imposition, if you like, to the rest of us who didn't cause trouble, wouldn't have included me, I'm far too old to stay out late in the Cross, but was that you needed to show ID. And if you were on the blacklist, you didn't get in, and obviously you went somewhere else, and hopefully you didn't cause violence there, but you certainly didn't cause violence in the Cross because you couldn't get in and drink. That measure, I think, never got a chance to prove its worth. But yes, your observation is legitimate. To conclude, though, that if the lockouts stop that, and therefore lockouts are okay, that's a leap of logic that I wouldn't agree with.
Jared?
Alright, so I'm going to start off with a little bit of an observation. We like memes in this group, right?
Yeah.
David, we've been the best template of all time if we went with sugar-free ultra.
Say that again slowly.
We would have the best meme template in history if you went with sugar-free ultra instead of...
If I would? Not sugar-free ultra.
Sugar-free
I pressed the wrong number in that bloody machine out there. That's what I ended up with. I was going for a coffee. I've never had it before in my life, and I'm not sure I'll ever have it again.
3 times the coffee.
But in a more serious
Please don't
note,
fall asleep.
one thing that was left out was a major turning point in the market solution that many believe had a major effect itself in the reduction of violence in the recent years that the lockout laws have been implemented, was the introduction of Uber in Australia. I, in my personal experience, find it to be probably the biggest change in the nightlife of Sydney overall. So would that factor into the lower levels of violence?
Well, I'm not sure if you're aware, but for a little while, Melbourne had lockouts as well. There was a substantial backlash against it, and they abandoned it. And one of the measures that accompanied the abandonment of lockouts was 24-hour trains. They ran the trains 24 hours. I'm not sure that's still occurring. At the time, I had reason to know what was going on in Melbourne, and I don't now. But certainly, the ability of people to get home when they're drunk in the middle of the night was a factor. So it may be that Uber's availability had some influence. Taxi drivers are quite well known for being reluctant to take drunk passengers. they worry about them throwing up in the car and never being able to get the smell out ever again. Which I don't blame them, to be frank. But so it may well be that the availability of Uber helped. Certainly, that was the availability of transport was a factor in Melbourne. But of course, Melbourne has since 2014 had all-night drinking if you want it. A lot of places don't stay open all night because there's not that much business. But if they want to, they can stay open all night and serve alcohol all night, and they don't consider that the lockouts are an appropriate response. Now that's Melbourne, which in other respects is nanny state heaven. So I think that tells you something.
Anyone else? Sam?
I was just going to ask a question to more of an evidence-based organic chemistry kind of question, but I came across one meta-analysis that talked a little bit about moderate drinking and severe drinking and that kind of stuff, and it talked a bit about how moderate drinking, in some people, it would actually improve health a little bit. You know, they'd build up a bit of resistance. I can't quote it off the top of my head, but what would you think about the fact that there's probably some, you know, for moderate drinkers, there's maybe some other health things that can occur. I don't know.
So you can find in the literature whatever bias, whatever you want in the way of your bias to be supported, okay? And it was the case, as I said, back in 1945, you could find doctors who were singing the praises of cigarettes. But I think the journey is going to see a point where we'll look back and say, did we ever acknowledge there was a safe level of ethanol? And I don't think it's going to be long. So it's interesting that David and Sachi have both been using words in the moral plane about bad and evil, and I haven't used that word. What I've tried to do is present dispassionately evidence. Now, before the Romans, I'm not sure if David's read the Torah or the Old Testament, the first thing Noah did when he hit shore was get smashed. For as long as man has been able to document, and I use that in a species, not a, as the human has been able to document the journey for others to comprehend, ethanol has been part of that. And the human is played with a lot of chemistry. It just happens that ethanol is predictable in its dose-related effects, and you reach a point where you either get so sick or you pass out, and you can sort of bounce back. And it is gibber juice. It'll loosen tongues and get a bit of social amenity going. But again, facts are it's a depressant. It is materially responsible for a lot of the depression, the disproportionate male suicide rates. That is fact. It is a depressant, psychoactive, addictive drug. And it just happens it's more freely available than it's ever been in Australia's history at a cheaper price across a range of hours. And as I say, as you keep pouring ethanol into the communities, you can get predictable dose-related effects. And if you want to see really scary evidence of what populations are consuming, I'll refer you to the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission wastewater analyses. And these are good objective evidences of what communities in Australia are consuming, metabolising and excreting. And they give some pretty interesting pictures. But far and away the most significant drug of concern is ethanol. Ethanol, ethanol, ethanol. $36 billion, as I said, in good objective evidence from 2008, 2010, and that is the biggest metabolite in all of the wastewater in all of Australia. And then you come down to the illicits, but they're the weed in the lawn of the problem, which is ethanol. And as I say, it's the multinationals that are purveying this stuff. We are in a unique position where Woolies, Coles and Aldi sell 80% of the grog. Oh, and by the way, Endeavour Drinks, the entity in Woolies, is the biggest owner of electronic gaming machines in South Australia, one of the biggest ranges of hotels in Queensland. They bought the hotels so that they could get the big packaged liquor out there. We are the only country that has allowed the duopoly to work in the way that it has. And that's why I come back to where I started. That restriction on takeaway sales, 10 p.m, packaged liquor restriction, whole of state delivered a tremendous benefit, 8.4% reduction, domestic violence, non-domestic violent assault, acknowledged by Honourable Cullen, and in the evidence before the recent Select Committee, there's an acknowledgement there's been a 9% increase in rural New South Wales in those non-DV assault rates after the wind back to 11 PM. So you can bet whole of state will see a further increase as we wind it back to midnight, and that little whole of state element of lockout laws has escaped the notice of most of the community in New South Wales. Most are completely unaware that that was an evidence-based, science-based policy recommendation that, and to Barry O'Farrell's tremendous credit and courage, when he announced those laws, how many can remember seeing it on TV? Now, he came to the camera on his own. There was no wallpaper, there were no police commissioners, there were no ministers, there were no minders. He came to the camera on his own, and he announced those February amendments. They were moved in double quick time through the Parliament, and it was on the basis of what had been rolled out 2008 in Newcastle. Exactly the same suite of proven measures in Australia's 6th largest city that's had this durable effect from 2008, an improved amenity for the locals. It's a much safer place. It is a more complex, more vibrant environment, much more dynamic. And it is that tranche of measures that was implemented in the Sydney Entertainment Precinct. So, as I said, there's a lot of evidence of the benefit. This is not about a moral right or wrong. It is about the human species. It is about the chemistry. And it is, unfortunately, the fact that in Australia we've got some fairly chilling statistics of the ethanol-related harm in our community.
So your question was, is there any level of beneficial consumption of alcohol?
Specifically, I remember coming across my meta-analysis. This was on a show that was comparing, the effect, the negative effects of alcohol, positive effects. Of course, there was a net negative, but like there were some moderate drinkers, if you do it low enough the nose, there was some kind of positive gut.
Yeah. So John made the point you can find research to support whatever viewpoint you want to start with. If you want to go from the evidence to the conclusion rather than from the conclusion to the evidence, the jury's still out probably, it's the safest thing to say, but there is speculation that moderate levels of alcohol consumption relax people, make them less anxious, they commit suicide at a lower level, so that extends average life expectancies, and people don't feel so miserable for the period in which they are moderately affected by alcohol, so low consumption. So they're talking about 2 drinks a day, I think, is the latest studies that I've seen, although I have to say that changes on a 5-year basis. The other thing is that if people are feeling better about themselves, they might take their medication for other issues, blood pressure, cholesterol, all sorts of other things that they might not take, but for the influence of the moderate amount of alcohol they take. There's all kinds of speculation about that. What we do know is that taken in isolation, alcohol is a poison. No question about that. And so if you want to take it in isolation and you never wanted to have anything to do with poisons, you wouldn't drink. That's fine. I don't have any quarrel with people who make that decision. But I do take issue with John's point saying that it's not a moral issue. It is a moral issue when the government says, I know what's good for you and I will do things either by taxing it or regulating it that will make you change the decision that you would otherwise make. If you're not hurting anybody else, the government should have no involvement in that decision. You are entitled to make bad choices, to make bad decisions for yourself. Your friends, your family, people who care about you are entitled to give you advice and say to you, don't do that. That's bad for you. People like John are perfectly entitled to say to you, there is scientific evidence, there is anecdotal evidence, there's observational evidence that says what you're doing is a bad choice and it will have adverse consequences for you. That's the end of it. That ought to be the end of it. When it becomes a matter for the law, and the law says you can't drink after a certain time at night, you have to go home to bed after a certain time at night, if you live in Sydney, but not if you live in Melbourne, then the law's gone too far.
I just wonder if I can be allowed. There are several lawyers here. How many of the New South Wales Liquor Act of 2007, can any of them take me through the objects of that act?
Lawyers don't memorise objects.
What? What are we here? We're talking lockout laws. You guys are lawyers.
Nobody memorises the objects.
I don't think
of the
most
law.
lawyers could answer that.
So the regulation and the control of the sale and supply of liquor / alcohol / ethanol. Okay? That's the object of the Act. All right? That's the legal requirement under the Act, to regulate and control the sale, supply and consumption of liquor. But there are requirements to mitigate alcohol-related harm in the Act by whoever is involved with the sale, the distribution or the consumption of liquor. So there's a balance in the Act. And we've had a priority of focus on the control and sale and consumption, and we've forgotten the key element of the Act. So this is not about nanny state. This is about doing the right thing within the terms of the legislation.
I was in the Senate where legislation was written and amended. Just because something is in legislation, let me tell you, does not make it smart, wise, intelligent, or the right thing. Making laws is like making sausages. You're actually better off if you don't know how the process occurs. It is such a shambles. And then to hold the end result up as some kind of sacred holy writ is just bizarre. You should not do it.
I'm horrified. This is coming from the law.
Yeah.
Senator.
All right. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you guys for coming out today. And yeah, hope you enjoyed that.